Webinar series. We are about a minute out from the start of the webinar. As is our tradition with our webinars, use the chat box at the bottom and let us know where you're coming from. Welcome Durango, welcome Oakland, coming in quick, Ohio, New York, Florida, Pittsburgh. Y'all, we are about 1 minute out to the start of the Tree Fund webinar series, our June edition. As you join us, please let us know where you're coming from. A little tradition that we started a number of years ago and we enjoy it. Welcome Kentucky, New York, Illinois, Toronto, Connecticut.
Hi. There's our international Singapore. Welcome, welcome.
Yeah, it's just beautiful with this technology, how we can really amplify the research that you'll be presenting today, Dr. Halle. It's wonderful to be able to do that. Wow. Well, my clock is reading the top of the hour. I know some of you are joining us from varying time zones from around the world, but to keep us on time and on schedule, I'll go ahead and get this webinar started. Heath, if you would hit the record button for me so that we can record this for future audiences.
We are.
So welcome everybody to the Tree Fund webinar series. My name is Bo Broadbeck. I work for Auburn University Extension, and as always, it is a pleasure to collaborate and work with Tree Fund to host this webinar series and to help moderate it. This webinar series, as you all know, brings new and emerging research in the field of urban forestry and arboriculture that has been funded by Tree Fund with the aim of ensuring that we have healthier, safer, and more resilient urban forests and the people that work in them. And so to help me today with some of the moderation duties, y'all get to see way too much of me. We've invited one of our ISA board members and a past trustee at the Board of Trustees at Tree Fund, Mr. Randy Miller. Randy, I will turn the virtual floor. Oh, sorry, I was asked one other duty real quick. Before I do that, just a couple of housekeeping items to keep in mind. There's a couple. The first one is continuing education points. As you all know, with this webinar series, we will not be sharing the code. And you do not need to provide your certification number. When you registered for this webinar, we asked for your certification number, and we will take the attendance records from today's webinar. We will compile that, and we will send it on your behalf directly to ISA. We do it this way because ISA has asked us to compile the information because these webinars have gotten quite large. Right now, we're at 400 of you attending, and so it's easier for them to work with that data in that sense. Another quick housekeeping note. Most of you have found the chat box. Thank you for chiming in. It's a great place for y'all to communicate amongst yourselves, share ideas, comments. Please keep them positive. But if you would like us to bring a question to Dr. Hale's attention, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It's just easier for us, especially with 400 of you on, to be able to monitor one place for questions. If you put them in the chat box, myself or Heath will ask you to put them in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Randy Miller.
Thank you, Bo. Well, on behalf of the Tree Fund, I welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon or this morning, this evening. I'm sorry, I wasn't going to say that because we're around the world, aren't we? But the purpose of the Tree Fund is to raise money to promote tree research and education. Everyone who is on this webinar right now has an interest in trees. Probably most of you make your living in trees. Many of you are certified arborists and are here to get continuing education credits for your certification. The research that the Tree Fund promotes, therefore, supports us as arborists and as people who are interested in trees. This year, the fundraising goal for Tour de Trees is $400,000. And you might think, well, that's a lot of money. But on the other hand, if we consider that there are over 36,000 certified arborists in the world right now, it's really disappointing to only come up with $400,000. Because you see, if every certified arborist made the tree fund part of their annual charitable giving at $100 a year, instead of $400,000, we'd have $3.5 million to do tree research and education, and we could do something transformative with it. So I urge everyone here, particularly those of you who are certified arborists, to consider making the tree fund part of your annual charitable giving at $100. Today's presentation is focused on, as a result of a Utility Arborist Research Fund grant, and it has an impact on the utility arborist field. But there are other grants that promote urban forestry, arboriculture, and then educating the next generation of arborists to whom we will entrust tree care. So this is very important work that the Tree Fund is doing, and so please support it. This year's Tour de Trees is going to help the ISA commemorate its 100th anniversary by riding through Connecticut, the place where the ISA started in 1921. We're also going to go through Rhode Island and through parts of Massachusetts out to Martha's Vineyard. But for those of you who can't help join us in the Tour de Trees, you can engage with us virtually and take the week to ride with smaller fundraising goals. So you can all participate and help the Tree Fund reach its goals and beyond. So today, our speaker is program developer at the Center for Environmental Inquiry at Sonoma State University. He's spent roughly 35 years developing sensor platforms, including leading technical teams, writing data interpretably and standards, and providing technical direction for large-scale capital projects. He's investing in the environment and quantifying climate change. He's been working at the Center for Environmental Inquiry for roughly 10 years, developing education into action teams, recruiting community partners, and developing academic and governmental collaboration. So speaking today on establishing a Western United States Integrated Vegetation Management Network, initial results, ancillary studies, and lessons learned, please help me welcome Dr. Christopher Halle. Dr. Halle?
Hi, thank you, Randy. Yes, I'm Chris. Let me try to share my screen here. This worked a minute ago, so let's give it a go. Is that okay? Okay, is that coming across okay?
Yes,
Yep.
perfect. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. I'll try to, keep it to about 40 minutes or so we have time for questions. And this might be a little bit different than a typical scientific presentation, in the sense that the focus really was on taking what we'd been doing and then trying to establish a network of sites in the Western US. So there'll be a little bit of scientific results, but there will also be quite a few lessons learned about how these collaborations have gone and are working. And I'd like to acknowledge our partners before we continue. This started actually with PG&E several years ago. Eric Brown and Peter Beasley came and talked to Claudia, who's the director of the center, and thought we could do something interesting under rights of way, reducing fire hazards, establishing native plant populations, and engaging the community. And that last educational piece is really important. And then when Eric moved to Sacramento Municipal Utility District, he and Peter helped balloon this into trying to establish a Western United States vegetation management monitoring network. And so with the fundraising they did and running the research through the Tree Fund, we submitted a proposal and have been working in that area for a few years now. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Pollinator Partnership. And they're very important because Dr. Vicki Wojcik came up with our monitoring protocols for looking at pollinators. And also they are a key partner because you can hire students from different universities through the Pollinator Partnership, which is a great recruitment tool and also allows you to bypass some of the university paperwork, which make it difficult to hire students from different universities. So they're kind of important if you're looking at expanding a network like this. So the reason I'm a program developer, besides the fact that my wife corralled me into helping, she's the director, is that I've been going back and forth between industry and academia for 35 or 40 years. And so I'm kind of a misfit toy in one sense, but in the other sense, I've got a foot in both worlds. So my role is to take what our students and faculty do and distill it down into pieces to pass on to industry so we can change best practices in the field of vegetation management in this case. And the reason that the center is involved in this, in projects like this, is our mission is really to get everybody pulling on the same oar, everybody involved in complex environmental challenges. And that means students of every discipline. So, you know, we've had philosophy students involved in investigating the relationship of man to power to nature, or business students, you know, talking about how to get the business community involved, or engineering students. And so it's more than just biology students, forestry students studying the environment. And also one of the points of this is we have preserves near cities. And so we give public tours to educate citizens about power lines, power distribution, and the fact that you can modify the environment without destroying the environment. And that message is really quite important in some of the areas where environmentalism writ large is incredibly active. So just a little bit of history and background, and these two pictures I chose them to illustrate the kind of breadth of what we're doing in the field. On the left is Carrie Wininger, who I guess started off as working for me, one of my students' interns on this right-of-way project, and she's doing pollinator sampling. She is now our outreach program director at the center. And on the right is a team of engineering students. And I went to them and I said, look, I'd like to have a drone that can fly over some of these remote sensing stations we have across the preserve, automatically download the data and bring the observations back to the central field facility, because you don't want to have to install internet connectivity or cell phone connectivity on every tiny little sensor you have. So they worked with the local drone manufacturer and were able to accomplish that. So that's just an example of the breadth of programs we have. So this began at our local preserve at Osborne many years ago. And the idea was to use the right-of-way under the power lines as a lever to kind of move the world, to engage the community and the students. And so, for example, we decided to study large animal movement. And so we installed on the right-hand side camera traps. And then we had to develop algorithms to identify the animal. So we wanted to study pollinators. And so we're doing pollinator sampling. We wanted to study habitats and ecosystems. So we're studying sudden oak death transmission, see if the rights-of-ways can provide a barrier to the spread of sudden oak death. And so the idea was, this is a loop, you know, we're in the middle, Center for Environment Inquiry, and we're studying how the rights-of-way affect the ecosystem. We're putting in instruments, we're feeding it back to our industry partners. And so this is going on for several years. And the idea was, once we demonstrated this, we could spread the model throughout the state of California to other universities and eventually nationally. So this is a map of all the field stations throughout California. It's the largest field station network in the world. And we're kind of in the middle there near San Francisco Bay. And we wanted to engage other industry partners and other universities in doing something very similar. And as part of this, we've worked with the UAA, and we've used some of the technology that our industry partners use, such as LiDAR, to look at the environment, to try to map what they're seeing in LiDAR with what we're doing on the ground, which ties into fire response and fire mapping out here in California. And a good reminder for me of that is that fire season has just started. So if I do end up having to dash, it's because there's a fire a few miles away, and maybe it's coming toward us. So it shouldn't happen. The winds died down, but it's a good reminder. One thing I want to return to later, and if I don't, please remind me, is community investment, because there are some interesting projects that have sprung off as a result of this. So we had a network, we studied it, we've done a lot of studies, and then Eric and Peter and the Tree Fund said, why don't you make this sort of Western US? Why don't you pick some sites in different ecosystems? We know there's a long-term bramble and burn study back east. It's been going on for 50 or 60 years, but the West is a different environment. The topography is different, the ecosystems are different. So with their help and the help of a lot of different experts throughout the country, we ended up doing the Fairfield Osborne Preserve, which is north of San Francisco Bay. We picked a site at Pepperwood Preserve, which is about an hour away. And then we picked a site at El Dorado National Forest. And they're three very different environments. So Fairfield Osborne, where we've been working, is generally a mixed oak woodland. It's local and incorporated into tours, so that's very important for public understanding of what integrated vegetation management is. And also, it's very important to promote the image of PG&E locally because of wildfire season. One thing that was interesting is Fairfield Osborne, when you trim the trees, when you remove some of the weeds you don't want in the site, what comes back is poison oak. And so that's a big safety issue. I'd never gotten poison oak. I'd been able to go roll around in it and be fine. But we ended up actually doing vegetation management on a very hot day, and it went through 2 layers of clothes. Everybody got it. And so we had to change our sampling practices based on what we saw in the field. It was horrible. Pepperwood is a very different site. It's oaks, conifers, and grasslands. And under the right-of-way, because it's been managed for a while, it's mostly grasslands along with some small bushes. It's also incorporated into tours. One thing that's interesting about the Pepperwood site is it's burned twice during the course of this study. And so watching it come back and see what species come back after the burn has been very instructive. Oops. And then El Dorado forest is more remote. It's higher elevation. It's mostly conifers and yerba santa. It is challenging to engage remote partners, but there are some we've identified. And one of the key takeaways from this has been that working with the Forest Service can be challenging. They are understaffed and they tend to move around a lot. And so when you think you have a partnership established and everybody's on the same page, suddenly somebody moves and nobody knows what's going on. So we ended up creating these signs. As Eric Brown said, nothing beats signage. So we ended up creating these signs so that they'll actually give us a call if they're going to do something on the plots. So so in establishing this, we had some discussions back and forth about the correct kind of vegetation monitoring protocol to use. And I was arguing for ocular estimates because they're fairly easy. And if you have ocular estimates, you can get an entire class of students out there. And because they're fairly simple and you can train people fairly easily, every student could do their own ocular estimate on the plot. And then you could gather all the different estimates and see what the variability is and what people come up with. And that's an interesting study in itself. And it's probably good enough to meet the right-of-way goals. The partners on the project argued that we needed to do an actual point transect model, which is more labor intensive, but is better suited to publication because it's perceived as more rigorous. And so, you know, that's a fair point. So that's the way we went. So we have these plots that are, you know, 50 meters by 16 meters. And so on, at each of those 3 sites, we set up a couple of plots, right? We have a mechanical plot where you're only allowed to trim or mow. And we have a mechanical plus herbicide plot where you're also allowed to do spot treatments of herbicides. And so the idea was to see how these different plots evolve through time and do comparisons of the plant populations and the pollinator response. So we've got these point transects, we've got 8 transects, they're 25 points each. And the idea is, I'm sure all of you know, is you come along with a pin flag and you drop a pin flag at each of these points, and anything the pin flag hits, you record. So at a given point, you can end up recording nothing, which is bare ground, or you can end up recording 8 species. You know, if there's 8 types of grasses that have their little feelers out in this particular airspace. One thing I would like to mention, this is fairly simple, and we've implemented it with students with the aid of one botanist. One thing I would like to mention is that we did have to adopt ocular estimates at Osborne because being in the field and crawling through poison oak was not the best plan going forward, even though we attempted to be safe. Now, the pollinator monitoring protocol, well, as I said, we did the official hiring through pollinator partnership, which made our life easier after the first year. Trying to hire students in a university from other universities is just a god-awful process you never want to do. And so our remote site, we needed to hire Sacramento State students because they're the ones that are near the site. And so that really made that possible. And pollinator monitoring is basically you take I think it's a meter by meter, maybe it's a little more, but let's say a meter by meter. You go out into a plot, into the mechanical only plot, for example, and you record how many types of pollinators, or how many pollinators come and visit the flowers or the plants in a particular plot. And so you just record that, and you do that for about 15 minutes, and then you do it on another quadrat. And you go to the mechanical and herbicide plot, you do the same thing, and then you go and find a natural area outside the right-of-way and make those observations again. You do it morning and afternoon so that you get some different readings. So you assess what pollinators are visiting what plants in each of the plots. And we typically assess them to functional groups, which is typically family or genus. We don't go all the way to species because that would be really damn hard to go all the way to species just by sitting there and watching them. And sometimes this is really quick. But the beauty of this protocol is you can train students to do it. You have 1 or 2 training sessions, and then the students actually lead the observations for the rest of the year. So that can be students, that can be interested community groups, of which there are some, that can be to staff at field stations. And so it's a simple enough protocol, but it gives you robust enough results to actually start making some real conclusions. One thing before I forget, COVID did hit in the middle of this, which was exciting. So everything had to be put on hold, and for whatever reason, field work had to be postponed. And I'd like to mention that, you know, the Tree Fund did extend the proposal to allow us to get a full 3 seasons of observations and then begin the write-up. And so that was really gracious and gave us some breathing room. One benefit of postponing the work is that we actually have observations over a longer period. And so even though we don't have them every year, we now have them over, you know, about 5 years, which allows us to say things about the longer term evolution of the plants in response to IVM. So it may have actually been a blessing in disguise. Okay, so all of that said, we've set up these plots, we're going out and observing vegetation. This is just a snapshot of what some of the observations look like at different sites. Each site has different dominant species, obviously. So El Dorado, you can see, Areodictyon californicum. I think I'm saying that right. Pepperwood, you can see a lot of, for example, Avena barbata or Brachypodium distachyon. So they're very, very different, right? One is a lot of conifers and Irisanta, one's a lot of different kinds of grasses. That point is important because for most of the sites that we've looked at, the vegetation is easily understandable enough that you don't need an expert botanist. For pepperwood, for a site with a lot of grasses, you actually do need an expert botanist to lead the sampling because learning all of those grasses would take a student quite a long time and it would still be very difficult. So that's just something to keep in mind when setting up a sampling scheme like this. And this is really what everybody seems to care about is pollinator observations. This is an old slide. Let me see if I can move this so I can see it. And so this is an old slide from, I like it, from Fairfield Osborne when we were doing this prior to the tree fund. And as you can see, this top graph is daily pollinator observations by year. And it's 2015, 2016, 2017. So there's a lot of fluctuations. And this is average number of pollinators observed per day. So 2015 is fairly low. 2016 was an incredibly wet year. And so you can see that, plants bloom, they stay blooming longer. And so we had more pollinators. And 2017 was more of an average year. So this is driven generally by large scale climate fluctuations. The other part of this that's interesting, I think, is that in 2015, when it was a drier year, this meadow, this blue bar, has an average of about, 10 pollinators observed per day in the open, unmanaged meadow. Whereas the right-of-way actually has slightly more visitation, say 15 pollinators observed per day in the right-of-way, in the managed area. And so the managed area there was definitely more beneficial. Whereas if you go to an incredibly wet year, the open unmanaged meadow has about 55 pollinators observed per day, whereas the right-of-way has decreased a little bit to about 35 pollinators observed per day. Now this gets whoa. Sorry, my computer just froze. There we go. This gets a little more complex when you look at the integrated floral diversity. So the number of plant taxa here on the left-hand side. And so in the unmanaged open meadow, we've got, many taxa. I think it's 98 taxa. So anyway, there's quite a lot of plant diversity in the unmanaged open meadow, but there's even higher plant diversity or floral diversity in the right-of-way. So when you start to couple these two together, you could almost argue that in 2015, in the dry year, the higher diversity in the row was actually better for the pollinators because, different plants are blooming. The bloom might have been extended in the dry season. Whereas in the wet season, absolutely everything is blooming. And so that diversity may not have mattered for the pollinators as much. And so we're taking right now the observations from the 3 sites that we've established and trying to do very similar analyses with them. And I can return to that at the end if there's time. That's one of the graphs I can return to if there's time. Now I'd like to switch a little bit from trees and pollinators into an ancillary case study. And the point of this is just to just to demonstrate how you can get students of all disciplines involved in fields like this. So we put out cameras to try to quantify excuse me, to try to quantify animal movement across the preserve. And one problem with putting out cameras is that you get a lot of false alarms because the grass moves, the clouds move across the ground. And so you can get over half of your images on the camera are false alarms. And that's very, very time consuming to deal with. So I'm an old school guy. I wanted to do some old school programming to figure this out. But I partnered with Gurman and Joseph, and they said, no, there's a better way. There's all this newfangled artificial intelligence that you've heard about for automobiles. So let's use some of that to try to determine what we can do. And so we got his entire class engaged in this. So the idea was to study animal movement and compare it to the integrated vegetation management. And to do that, we put out 6 different cameras. They were triggered to take 3 pictures every time the motion sensor was triggered. And one of them was set to only record nighttime observations because it was near a popular trail. And this is, just as a preview, this is the output of those computer models on the camera. So in the top right, you can see it's just a picture of a trail. It's a picture of there's no animal there. And so the computer model says it's a false alarm. And the score is 0.995, right? So that means it's 99% certain that this really is a false alarm, that there's no animal there. So that's what we're going for with this kind of a computer model. We don't need to do that. And so the idea is we do something called transfer learning. And so the only point to this is if you're going to do this from scratch, you need millions of images, you need to train on millions of parameters, you need supercomputers, and you need a lot of time. But what we were able to do is use something called transfer learning. So that was to take somebody's previous analysis that had been trained on all of these images, and they had already trained their computer model to detect edges, to detect patterns, to detect colors, to detect shapes. And so we took all those training sets that they already had and just basically glommed on our images at the end. And then it only takes a few minutes to create a computer model that you can actually use for your own predictions. And so that's how we were able to get this entire class engaged in setting this up and getting this working. And so this is, again, an example of the data set. The cameras were set up to hopefully capture, an animal in the sequence of 3 images. Hopefully one gets the animal, and we do have mountain lions on the preserve. And the purpose of this slide is simply to remind me that we have a lot of animals, and we had about 25,000 pictures and about 11,000 false alarms. And that's a big deal for us because false alarms can take anywhere from, it can take 3 people anywhere from 2 weeks to a month to try to cull all of those out of a data set, because it can be really tricky to see if there was an animal there or not. And so the point of this is to not only save us money, but the state of California is starting to put in cameras on a 1 kilometer square grid in different areas of the state to try to get population estimates. And that's going to be an awful lot of false alarms. And so if we can save them money, I think we've done some good and gotten our students involved in some interesting projects. So we're going to talk about scenario A here. And scenario A simply means we have 6 cameras across the preserve. They've all taken pictures. We're going to apply this model to all of those cameras. We're going to feed in all those pictures to this model and see what comes out. The computer keeps. Okay. And so this is generally what came out. So like I said before, this slide, this picture in the upper left, the computer model thought it was 99% a false alarm, and it is indeed a false alarm. If you look at the upper right, the computer model is 98% certain it's a false alarm, and it is. Now, if you look in the lower left, it says this score is 0.871. So the computer is 87% certain it's a false alarm. But there's a coyote just exiting frame left. Or if you look on the lower right, the computer model says, I'm 60% certain it's a false alarm. And if you squint and turn your head just right, you can see there's a squirrel on the right. So the computer model is not always right. But this certainty score or this threshold means you can start to vary it and play games and then see how accurate this computer model is. And so that's the entire point of this slide. So this big panel on the left, it says, what if we require, we say to the computer model, anything that you think is 50% certain to be a false alarm or better, you just call it a false alarm. You just throw it out of the data set. What happens? Right? So you go down to the nothing category here, and you say, well, in that case, and you go down to the axis on below, which runs from 0 to 1. In that case, we get rid of 90% of the nothing category, right? So if we're only 50% certain that something's a false alarm, we get rid of it. We get rid of almost all of the false alarms, almost all of the nothings, and that's great. That's what we want to do. The problem is you actually end up getting rid of vehicles and quails and possums and rabbits as well, right? So if you go and look at the quail category, for example, in that case, and you go down to the axis below, you end up getting rid of 70% of the quail. So you've just gotten rid of a whole bunch of animals by using this particular threshold. So you got rid of all the false alarms, but you threw out a bunch of animals. So then if you go to the graph on the right here and you say, okay, we're only going to get rid of false alarms out of this data set if we are 97% certain that they are false alarms, what happens? Well, you go down to the nothing category and you've gotten rid of half the false alarms, which is good, right? You've gotten rid of half of them. You saved yourself a lot of work. You didn't get rid of all of them, but you also didn't get rid of anything else, right? And so those two views of the world allow you to do different things. In the first case, where you want to get rid of all the false alarms, and you also get rid of animals, that's okay if you've got a network that is set up for real-time education or public education. So if you want to have folks in the public or students sign up and get a picture of the latest animal in the right-of-way, that's okay, because you don't want to send them nothing. On the other hand, if you're doing research, if you're doing population estimates, if you're doing movement, you don't want to get rid of animals. And so you have to take the hit of not getting rid of all your false alarms. And so that's the kind of thing a computer model lets you play with. So yeah, so like I was saying, real-time education or research depends on how you set that screening threshold. And then it sets up a lot of time saving for you. And in the future, we want to expand this. And we'd like to go from simply classifying animals to animal detection to engaging the public, because that's been a very powerful tool for growing programs like this. And I always show this picture just because it brings a little tear to my eye. When I got involved with the center, one of the incentives was its benefit for students. And so Raphael here was my first student who had taken a programming class on campus and had done sort of okay, but was a little bit lost in his studies, I guess. And so we went out into the field, we set up the cameras, I started to talk to him about how to program these things and program code. And at the end, he actually ended up getting a local job so he could help his family. And his job was actually in computer vision processing with a local tech company. And so there is this huge ancillary benefit to collaborations like this, even for non-biology students. So I'm going to shift a little bit into lessons learned for this particular network. And most of these lessons will be my opinion with other people's opinions thrown in, but they're going to be sort of network and collaboration type lessons. And then I'll look toward the future. And so as part of this lessons learned, I was invited to be on a panel with these other wonderful folks in the bottom right at row 13 in Charlotte. And I think one of the things, I keep bringing up is this focus provides an opportunity to leverage interest and funding across disciplines. This is important because we want everybody to, be pulling on the same oar environmentally, but it's also important because it helps break down barriers between academia and industry. And I think that's very important in the long run. Carolyn Mahan, Dr. Carolyn Mahan, who's at the panel at podium there, kept making the point that sampling using universities is cheap, right? You get good value for your money. So you're going to get more sampling, more in-depth sampling, more analysis if you use students and faculty than if you have a short-term need and you simply hire a consultant. And my other point, of course, is, use pollinator partnership to help break down barriers and fund interns and make the research possible. Now, one other point that people kept bringing up in this panel and also in the questions was, it's better if this is a true collaboration between universities and industry. So for example, one of the hopes when we started this was we would start monitoring Annandale State Park, which is nearby. And I spent several months of my life trying to get that to happen. But as you guys may know, each state park director is like a king or queen unto him or herself. And so I'd set up and write the research proposal and everything would look good. And then the director would always say, well, we don't want research in our park, we're only for recreation. Nobody wants to see a research sign. And you may disagree with that violently, but they do have the final say. One workaround with that was if PG&E had allowed us to actually be volunteers for PG&E and have little magnetic decals on the truck, then we could have gone in and done sampling and Annandale would have been fine with that. But then that starts to get into legal issues. And so ironing out, if you have a specific site in mind, ironing those things out beforehand is really important, and you do need industry input. One thing we've had, I always include this slide because I like the picture, but one thing we've had happen here in Sonoma County with all the environmentalist movement is that there is this misperception of what risk is on both sides. So the public thinks you should not do anything unless it's absolutely safe, which of course is impossible to determine. The reaction is, everything is safe unless there is evidence otherwise, which is clearly not true. And so you end up in this doom loop where nobody talks to each other. And so we've had some success where we take people out and say, of course, we're modifying the environment. You can modify the environment. It's okay. Here's what's happening. And so we try to avoid this entire conversation. So into the future. Into the future. This panel on the left is just to show some of the work we've done, ground truthing, some of the LiDAR that our industry partners have flown over the preserve. But I keep thinking about a lot of this work, a lot of this right-of-way work is very disparate. It takes place at sites across the United States. So there's already an informal network going on of researchers with their own interests, of universities with their own interests, looking at vegetation management and related issues. And they all have some level of in-depth research and some level of student involvement. But it's cheap for the benefit if everybody could collaborate and establish this huge network. And just for completeness, I'll send my slides after the presentation, but this link at the bottom is actually the industry panel we gave at row 13 in case people are interested. So I'd encourage you to go watch that. But the thing that keeps banging around in the back of my head is establishing a national network would have some real advantages. And this is just a map of different utilities in the Western United States. But if you could pool resources and kind of guide the research, then it gives not only this research backbone and engaging students, but it's also a way to develop a workforce. Because I don't know about all the utility partners, but I know that, like the energy industry, which I was a part of, there's significant graying of the workforce going on in some partners. So I think engaging students, getting them aware of these issues and bringing them up nationally would be a benefit to everybody. And then if we could frame this as part of a larger sustainability vision, that would have some real value. So one of the models I keep proposing, kind of this integrated field station model, or this joint industry project model. And the idea is, there'd be an executive director to run the thing and a steering committee. And the steering committee would help guide the research, help, vote on various proposals, but help provide feedback. But it would be made up of interested academic partners, interested industry partners. And the idea would be to have some baseline research at all of these sites. So it'd be kind of like an LTER network, like a ecological research network, but you'd have basic pollinator observations and basic vegetation observations. So instead of having climate stations and then going out and doing research studies and trying to figure out what's going on, you'd have vegetation and pollinator observations, and all of the other interesting studies you might do would fit into that. So you've got a basic network backbone. And then every year you might vote on a few other projects to do in this kind of a network. And it would just keep it going and allow you to more effectively write grants and to fit in with goals like 30 by 30 that are starting to become important across the United States. And finally, just want to mention that one of our students that's gone through these programs, we have basically all of our students have gone on to various industry jobs, but one of them, the quote is, "I'm walking away with leadership, teamwork, communication, and creativity skills." And our partners are saying that, aside from engineering, where you need some actual engineering experience, or computer science, where you need computer science experience, a lot of our partners are simply saying, we'd rather hire a student that can work on a team that could communicate and we can train them technically than having a specific skill. And I think that's really important, because we are talking about the generation that has gone through COVID, that lives on their phones. And so teaching them how to be part of these multidisciplinary collaborative teams is incredibly important. And so with that, I think I'll stop sharing, and we have some time for some questions and some discussion.
Dr. Hill, thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. We do have a couple of questions, and Randy, I guess you and I can. And for those of you all listening in, please go to if you have any questions for Dr. Hill, please go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in some questions, and we'll bring them to Dr. Hill's attention. And just because I've seen some questions real quick, before I jump into questions, Dr. Hill, just as a reminder with ISA CEUs, the way CEUs work on this webinar series is when you registered, you provided your certification number, name, and then we're going to cross-reference those with the attendance records for today's webinar, and we will submit those on your behalf directly to ISA. So there's no need for you all to do anything. ISA does ask for about 4 to 6 weeks to post those. This is a large webinar, so sometimes we're sending hundreds at a time directly to ISA. So just as a reminder. Randy, do you want to jump into the first question?
Sure. The question is focused on Pinus attenuated, which is knobcone pine. And it's questioning why it needed to be controlled. Was it not desirable in the right-of-way?
Oh, why pine trees aren't desirable in the right-of-way?
Yeah. Specifically in this case, it says knobcone pine, but I would assume it would extend to every pine tree.
Okay. So for our El Dorado site, the power lines are fairly close to the ground, I guess you could say. So yeah, we needed to have those removed from underneath the power line, and then we had to create a margin where if the pine trees did fall over in a windstorm or something like that, it wouldn't take out the power line. So it was kind of a height issue in that sense.
Thank you.
I'll jump in with the next one. Somebody asked, is AI good enough yet to have it recognize a number of animals, common animals such as squirrels, deer, etc.?
It is. It's interesting. AI, I have this love-hate relationship with AI because I'm a technical guy, but I'm also a Luddite. And it is good enough to recognize common animals, you know, like deer and quail and bobcats. It will probably have difficulty distinguishing between certain types of deer, like certain species might be a problem because they can look very similar. That said, if you have there are error bounds on it. And so if you're looking for a particular animal that is rare in your area, it can be hard to train an AI model or to take it at face value. So you know, for common animals, it's probably, you know, really, really simple and easy to use in that sense. And for more rare animals, you got to think more carefully about how you're going to do that.
Thank you.
Have a
Randy, you want to
question.
jump in with the next one? Let's go back.
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
can I say one more thing?
Yes.
One
Sure.
of the, sorry, one of the panelists, what's interesting about the AI thing too, one of the panelists, I'm going to forget her name, Kim Russell, Dr. Kim Russell, is actually using AI to look at wings and wing patterns of pollinators to have it be able to tell pollinators by species. And so it really can be very powerful for things like that as well.
Question here
Wow, that's
about, I'm sorry to interrupt you both.
No, go ahead.
Okay, question here about using remote sensing and remotely piloted aircraft into monitoring tree and shrub species or presence abundance and plant diversity in rights of way. There's an observation here that seems like an opportunity that more utilities could use for right-of-way vegetation management for general safety and wildfire mitigation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, for a while, PG&E was, and they might still do it. They haven't done it at our place for a while, but they're flying really low and doing this high resolution LiDAR. And of course, that's very effective. You know, I forget we were getting 40 points per meter or something like that. And it's even more effective if you start to do hyperspectral things, because you can start to look at different plants and water stress and stuff like that. We do have a couple of faculty that are trying to look at the use of satellites from space. And I haven't checked in with that for a couple of years. I know it starts to be a bit of a resolution issue, you know, unless you're looking at wide swaths of land, but I'm not sure exactly where that is. But I think flying from aircraft and flying from drones is really powerful. And one of the things academically that's been very interesting is if you want to do something with drones, you go into a class of engineers and you say, I need some kids to fly a drone. And everybody wants to play with the damn drone, right? And so it's a huge recruitment tool. And so I think there could be some interesting benefit there to pairing up with some engineering schools if you have an issue you'd like to look at.
And I'd add that I think it's an area of focus among utilities now,
Right.
To use remote sensing, whether it's LiDAR or satellite hyperspectral imagery. Even ground-based LiDAR now is starting to gain some traction in some applications. So it's still nascent, but it is a growth area for utilities and utility arboriculture right now.
Mhm.
Oh, you're frozen up.
I'll jump in with the next question.
Okay.
And somebody asking, you go back and discuss the pollinator. Randy, can you take the questions next week?
Yeah. Can you go back and discuss the pollinator tables and explore the reason for the differences? The assumption, the questioner's assumption is a go-to from rangeland degree where it was due basically to levels of disturbance. It might be the oddball arborist who actually studied grasses, he observes, or she. I'm sorry, Brandy, she.
Not sure I totally understand the question. Let's see here. Let me, oops. Let's try this here. Okay. Is that what we're talking about? Or is it that? I'm not sure what the,
Well, the reference is to pollinator tables.
okay, this was the, so that was the veg table and that's the pollinator figure I had. So, so that is interesting. There is, let me go back to the actual site here. So there is a level of disturbance at all of these sites. So for example, the grasses here under the right-of-way were established by removing trees, right? Removing trees, removing shrubs. And so that's pepperwood. And also grazing. You know, they use grazing as an active tool. And so you're right in that some of the plant community has been established and maintained by grazing and also by actively managing invasives. And so they're trying to go for a all native community. So that is absolutely true. And if you go to the El Dorado site, it was also burned in 20 something or other, 15, 16. It was also burned, but that has also been actively managed. And so that's one reason. And that's a really good point, is that not all of the response is due to the management. It's not all due to the treatment. So after the burn and after all this management, and there have been animals on that land as well. One of our plots is different, completely different than the other plots, but that's not due to treatment differences. That is in fact due to the history differences, the disturbance differences. And so that's absolutely true. I don't know if that quite gets at the question. I think it does.
Seems to. Heath, do we have time for one more?
Just so you know, Bo just lost connection with us. Yeah, we have time for one more question and then we will wrap up.
Okay, so the next question, and by the way, our custom is to present all the questions to our presenter. And, you know, Dr. Halle can answer these in time in the next few days, because there are several questions that have not been addressed yet. The last question we have time for is, what herbicide mix was used along with mechanical cutting?
Oh, that's funny. I knew this was going to come up. You know, honestly, I'm going to have to pass on that and ask later. I wasn't actually, I was there for it, but and we recorded it, but I honestly can't mix. It was actually different every time. It, you know, it was based on what they needed to treat and how much they needed to treat, but I honestly can't remember.
Right. Well, thank you. Heath?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. As a reminder for everyone, we hope to have this posted on our YouTube page in about 1 week. It does take some time to download and get up and make sure it fits there just fine. I will send Dr. Halle an email with all of these questions, those that were answered and unanswered, and he can respond to those as seen fit. And you will find both that link to the YouTube page and the answer to his questions and his report on our webinar archives page at treefund.org. So thank you again for all that are attending and that attended. We will send an email afterwards to let you know when your CEUs were recorded by ISA. Any other questions, please email us at education@treefund.org. Thank you again.
Okay.
I have a
Thank you,
question.
Dr. Halle.
Oh, yes. One more, Dr. Halle.
Can I ask anyone who's actually interested or thinks this national network idea is a good idea or wants to be involved somehow, just please email me because our partners are actually also looking to try to do this. And I think it would be very exciting.
For your email address for everyone's convenience?
Oh, sorry. It's HALLE@sonoma.edu.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Good
Yeah.
information.
Oh, thank you.
Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye, everyone.